So, what a mess we have south of the border. How many of you are deeply concerned about what's going on in American politics and really want some answers? Well, I count myself in the same boat. And in days when I'm not turtled up in a corner desperately trying to avoid the news, it motivates my research in political science. What I'm particularly concerned about is the increasing rejection of policy expertise and science in some segments of the public, and in the rise of misinformation. How many of you think a big part of the problem is, well, to put it bluntly, conservatives or people on the political right? And if you think that, there's reason to believe it. After all, conservatives are more likely to reject climate science. And despite a professed belief in markets, they're most often at odds with the advice of economists on the social benefits of carbon taxes and immigration. And we've seen the rise of fake news on the right. Websites have popped up, some of them designed to look legitimate, like the Boston Tribune or fake ABC News on the screen. And they spread misinformation and lies. And that's to say nothing of the impact of Donald Trump on American politics. But it may surprise you to know, as it did to me when I was doing my research, that the rejection of expertise and the embrace of misinformation isn't solely a conservative phenomenon. We all do it at times. For example, some liberals are often at odds with the expert consensus on a number of issues where it conflicts with their worldviews. For example, the scientific consensus that genetically modified foods are as safe as conventional alternatives. Or the consensus among conservative and liberal economists that free trade is good not just for us, but for our trading partners as well, by lowering the costs of goods and services and expanding market access for developing countries. We've also seen the rise of fake news on the left, which is preying on people's anxiety, deep-seated anxiety they feel about the Trump presidency. Twitter feeds have popped up by people claiming to be rogue staffers in the Trump administration. Snopes and others can find no evidence that they're real. And viral articles have spread, some with shocking headlines that seem reasonable for progressives that read them, but are fake nonetheless. So what on earth is going on here? Well, the point I want to make to you tonight is that neither side of the political divide has a monopoly on truth or fact. That we all selectively engage with information in our political environment to serve the social interests of the groups that we identify with and our own social identities. The root of this is in human evolution. People that were able to cooperate socially in group settings had an inherent advantage over those that could not. And part of ensuring that effective cooperation is preventing free ridership, or the betrayal of the group for personal gain. Those that were able to put the group first, even at their own expense, had an advantage in surviving in the long run. So over time, our impressive cognitive abilities have become hardwired not to seek out truth or fact, but to serve the goals and interests of the groups that we deeply identify with. So we often reflexively accept information that serves their interests and will reject information on a hair trigger or counter-argue it away if it undermines their interests. Our intuition guides our reason. We don't do this consciously. And this is not just about politics. It affects us in all facets of our daily lives when our groups are at risk. Even in sports, I'm a long-suffering Buffalo Bills fan. There's young me on the left. There's current me on the right. Sad. The Buffalo Bills have the misfortune of being in the same division as Tom Brady and the New England Patriots. So I really, really, really don't like Tom Brady. When people say, oh, well, he's the greatest quarterback of all time, I have trouble accepting that. 5 Super Bowls, records, oh, he's clutch. And I'll come up with all sorts of different justifications for why that's not the case. Well, he had great defenses. He had excellent coaching. You can't compare him to other quarterbacks. or the reason you're probably most familiar with, well, he cheated by deflating footballs, spying on other teams. Who knows what else is going on there? And these are reasonable justifications on the face, but I don't come to them with a desire to really know who the best quarterback is. They're merely rationalizations for something I will believe regardless of the evidence. So what does this mean in the practice of politics? Well, it means that often the case that information isn't enough, whether it's climate science or economic research on free trade or fact checks. Why? Because information is rarely neutral. It has implications for the social groups that we deeply value. And often is at times we are just simply not motivated to accept information seriously that undermines those interests. The second thing that it means is that this is hardly an American phenomenon. That as any society becomes more deeply polarized ideologically, the incentive for this motivation increases. And this is happening in Canada. Scholars have shown, like Chris Cochran at U of T, that Canada's political parties have polarized over the last few decades. Conservative parties have moved to the right, the Liberal Party has moved to the left, and the center has become vacant. And this has trickled down into public opinion. I'm going to show you some data from the Canadian election study. The graph I'm about to show you plots how negatively people feel about the party that they are ideologically opposed to, on a 0 to 50 scale, with 50 being neutral. And what the data shows is that over time, Liberal supporters and NDP supporters have increasingly come to dislike the Conservative Party and its legacy parties. Not just the Harper years. And Conservative supporters have increasingly come to dislike the Liberals. And while they've never really liked the NDP, unsurprisingly. So over time, Canadians used to really like their own party, but they were more or less ambivalent towards the parties that they opposed. But that's no longer the case now. They really, really don't like them, and it's getting worse. And this is an awful lot like what we see in the United States, where Democratic and Republican supporters increasingly have come to dislike the opposing party, not just the party itself, but its supporters as well. So Canadians, just like Americans, are now motivated more than ever to see the world through a partisan or ideological lens. Some of the research I'm working on at UBC looks at exactly this question, the degree to which Canadians are biased in our perceptions of politics. I surveyed UBC undergraduate political science students, broadly anti-conservative sample. I asked them to give me their evaluation of the state of the Canadian economy, and I gave them either a piece of positive or negative information about the economy that contradicted their beliefs. They were then given the ability to change their mind about the economy. Students were sorted into two groups. One in which the implications of that economic information benefited or hurt the current Liberal government, and another where it reflected on the record of the previous Harper government. If Canadians are biased in our perceptions of politics, we expect they only change their minds about the economy if it benefits their team, in this case, the Liberal Party of Canada. And that's exactly what we find. When given a piece of positive information about the economy, they change their minds overwhelmingly when it benefits the Liberals, and hardly at all if it benefits the Conservatives. And the mere opposite is true when given negative information. They're more willing to think the economy is doing poorly if it reflected badly on the legacy of the Harper government, but didn't change their minds at all on average when it hurt the current Liberal government. So Canadians, just like Americans, are biased in our perceptions of politics. What can happen down there can happen up here as well. So what can we do? The story I've told you is rather bleak. We're all hardwired to reject information, or at least not engage with it seriously if it goes against the interests of our social groups. And these identities have never been more salient than they are nowadays. There aren't any easy answers, but there are three things I think we can do to make our politics a little bit more productive. First, we need to become more skeptical consumers of political news that's shared, especially on social media. Fake news isn't going away. It preys on our instinctual reaction to accept information that benefits our partisan or ideological identities. And we don't even recognize fake news when we see it. A collaborator of mine at UBC, Dominic Stetzula, surveyed UBC students who are really politically engaged. He asked them to rate the legitimacy of various fake and real media sources on a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 is very legitimate. What he found was that students could scarcely distinguish between highly credible news sources like the Globe and Mail and well-designed fake news sites like fake ABC that I showed you earlier. He also found that students tended to perceive fake news sites as more legitimate than news sources they ideologically disagree with. So if fake news comes to Canada, we're vulnerable to its effects. We instinctively accept information that benefits our social groups, and we don't even recognize fake news when we see it. So we need to do a better job to be skeptical of news stories that are clearly designed to manipulate our intuitions and our emotions. We need to be more curious and more skeptical. We need to bolster our inner fact checkers, because fake news isn't going away. It also wouldn't hurt to break out of our ideological silos. By exposing us to a greater number of viewpoints, we'll better be able to pick up on stories of dubious validity. In a sense, we outsource our fact-checking to more motivated others. The second big thing we need to do is become more aware of our own ideological biases. I used to be a dyed-in-the-wool partisan. I worked and volunteered for federal and provincial conservative parties for a number of years, and then afterwards I became a deeply ideological libertarian. I lived in an echo chamber. Don't be like old me. In the course of my research, I began to gain a greater appreciation of my own cognitive bias. And I was able to break out of that silo and update some of my more questionable beliefs, like denying the reality of climate change. This information, the awareness of our own bias, is a crucial tool for an effective democratic citizen. This information needs to be exposed to young people at an early age, just like civics. Without it, we delude ourselves into thinking that facts are only in the domain of our own ideological group. And that has the implication of us tending to talk down to those that disagree with us. And that creates a toxic environment that makes cross-partisan persuasion impossible. Which brings me to my third point. We really need more cross-partisan persuasion. With a little bit more humility, it's possible. And it's the only way we can effectively tackle the pressing challenges of our time, like dealing with climate change, that require societal consensus. We might be surprised by the world of opportunities that are out there that go unexplored. There are solid conservative arguments for dealing with climate change. Great free market economists like Milton Friedman were in favor of taxes on pollution, and that logic easily extends to dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. And there are conservatives, prominent ones right now, that support this view, like former Reform Party leader Preston Manning and current conservative leadership candidate Michael Chong. But instead, climate change activists tend to preach to the choir. They heighten the ideological divisions that exist on this issue, labeling lots of people as anti-science or ignorant. And that's a mistake. We don't overcome motivated reasoning. We don't overcome our bias by putting people on the ideological defensive. We have to allow themselves to reconcile their values and beliefs with the advice of policy experts and scientists, and that can only happen when we depolarize an issue. We need to do a better job at improving our political discourse. We can't be complacent. The politics that's infecting the United States can come here, if it hasn't already. With a little bit more humility, we won't be able to overcome our cognitive biases entirely, but we can make our politics maybe a little bit more productive, a little bit more civil, and hopefully a little bit more factual.